As a blogger, I've had quite a few surprises, but the biggest has been the interest of readers in handwriting. I never expected it, but when I posted defending the teaching of handwriting, I had more interest than when I expressed my opinions on subjects like the politics of firearms. Why is this so? What is there about handwriting that makes people so passionate? The big reason, I think, is that handwriting is part of our education. It's part of a very formative part of our education. It's part of a system of conformity where we learn to do things in a certain way, but it's also part of expressing our own personality. And the history of handwriting is really the story of how people have been reconciling those two features of writing systems. I'd like to talk about what happened to handwriting after the printed book was introduced. What's been the role of handwriting in the age of Gutenberg, and how has print actually helped as much as it has hurt the study of handwriting? The same is true, by the way, of computers. Let's look at Gutenberg and his age first. The most important thing to me about Gutenberg was how he was the culmination of centuries and centuries of European innovation in writing. Take the book as we know it. It's called a Codex. It consists of folded and gathered signatures of paper in some kind of binding, whether paper or hardbound. This is in great contrast to the ancient system of writing on scrolls. This was a medieval innovation, really one that took off from the use of codices in late antiquity. But there was more to it than that. So many of the features of the book that we know really predate Gutenberg. Take, for example, the type that we use, which is derived from the types of the Renaissance, so-called antique letters or ancient letters. It turns out that these letters were not, as the European humanists thought, the way the ancients actually wrote. They were the result of centuries of experimentation and innovation in developing a system of uppercase and lowercase letters that form our familiar text. Or take the way that words are written. In the ancient world, they were written in a system called scriptura continua. There was no break between words. It was really a system of oral performance. You had to sense out the meaning of the words. You had to pre-process them as you were reading. You really had to speak them out. And the institution of space between words was a revolution because it meant that Latin could be taught to people whose native language was not Latin. And it also meant that silent reading was now possible, and we'll see in a minute why that was so important in the European libraries of the late Middle Ages. The technology of reading was also a medieval invention. Consider eyeglasses, for example, which let people continue reading much longer into their careers. The ancient Romans had the scientific and technological knowledge to invent eyeglasses, but they didn't for very complex social reasons. Medieval Europeans, though, were much more practical about such things, and so eyeglasses emerged in Italy in the High Middle Ages and were very widely adopted by Gutenberg's time. Or consider the writing desk. We take desks for granted, but actually they had not been widely used for writing in antiquity. Ancient manuscripts were almost always produced by writing on the knee. We can see the result of the medieval system of books in a library that was built in Cesena, Italy in 1452, about the time when the Gutenberg Bible was in production. It still exists. It's called the Malatestiana. It's the first municipal library in the world, and it consists of a large and spacious hall with hundreds of codices that are available for public use chained to desks for security reasons. These books really don't look that different from the books that we have today. Of course, they're much more valuable. They were written largely on parchment, although another European innovation of the time is paper. But there was already, by Gutenberg's time, a vigorous book trade based entirely on handwriting. There were professional copyists who could make a book of any text that you wanted, and there were authors like the theologian Gerson, who became so popular that there was a very active sale of their books. In fact, scholars believe that the book trade as such really dates from Gerson's time. So we had all the ingredients of the book in the age of handwriting. The book world was made possible by handwriting, and what Gutenberg really did was to see that that handwritten world was now so large that it was worth the risk and the investment in developing an entirely new technique for producing books. Just because the printed book was the culmination of centuries of experiments and innovations, though, doesn't mean that it wasn't revolutionary. It was. It allowed a very considerable expansion of education. It allowed many different kinds of information to be circulated more rapidly and in different ways. And it also enabled people to study writing and handwriting more efficiently. Medieval humanism was not just the cultivation of learning for its own sake, although that played an important part in its justification. A humanistic education was a very practical one. It prepared you for a career in the church or in a civilian bureaucracy. So the printed book and a good handwriting were important tools for a young person who wanted to make his way in the world. The most influential handwriting was a kind developed at the papal court. It was called Chancery, and it survives today in italic. This italic handwriting was also the basis of the italic fonts that we know today. Learning any kind of script was a very important skill. In fact, on some royal documents in England, the signature of the secretary is almost as large as the signature of Queen Elizabeth I herself. Writing also remained important in publishing. Many manuscripts circulated, much as books would, copied and passed from hand to hand for various reasons. There were household books, books of medicine that were often written by women and circulated among their friends. Poetry was also, to a large extent, a business of manuscript publication. John Donne wrote, "What printing presses yield, we think good store, but what is writ by hand, we reverence more." 4,000 manuscript poems of Donne survive, but only one was written in Donne's handwriting. Poems were usually published only after an author's death. Sometimes they were collected, though. In any case, the publication of a poem was considered a great tribute. Poems circulated more or less like the blogs of today. And just as today, somebody's exceptional blogs will occasionally be collected as a book, or blogs might be anthologized, so it was a sign of unusual respect when poems, either by one poet or by a number of them, were actually put together as a book. Another way to think of early modern manuscript publication is in terms of Soviet samizdat. Some publications were too controversial to have names signed to them, too risky for printers, so they circulated in manuscript. Printed book publishers also recognized the importance of handwritten handwritten documents. Many books, for example, had little hands actually printed in the margin. And the hands were printed at passages that the author or the publisher considered especially important. And readers were encouraged to take their copybooks, which were very often kept in the Renaissance and the early modern period, and write these gems down in their copybooks. So the book then was part of a system of writing. People very commonly wrote on the margins of their books, or they wrote in notebooks, and the borders between the printed book and the manuscript were in practice very porous. People also had the urge to write as they do now while they were traveling. John Milton, and no doubt other writers, had portable writing sets that consisted of 2 cut-down quill pens and a tiny bottle of ink with a cork stopper in a case that's about the size of an eyeglass case of today. And you can imagine somebody carrying this in a terribly expensive 19th century vest. It must have been quite an experience. There were still limits to writing before 1800. The technology that Benjamin Franklin used was not terribly different from what Milton had 100 years before. There was still the quill pen, there was still handmade paper. The real revolution didn't come until 1800, when the beginnings of mass literacy were visible. The first big step was continuous production paper. Cheap paper, as much as anything else, was a basis of popular education, popular literacy, and the growth of the white-collar workforce as the 19th century went on. But there was another technology too, one that's often underestimated, the steel pen, which was first widely manufactured in England, in Birmingham, starting in the 1830s and 1840s. The steel pen was the application of England's Industrial Revolution to the world of education and learning. And people at the time recognized it as a very big deal indeed. A Yale senior, George Pratt, wrote a poem in 1857, beginning, "Give me a pen of steel, away with the gray goose quill. I will grave the thoughts I feel with a fiery heat and will. I will grave with a stubborn pen on the tablet of the heart, words never to fade again, and thoughts that shall ne'er depart. Give me a pen of steel, hardened and bright and keen, to run like the chariot's wheel when the battle flame is seen, and give me the warrior's heart to struggle through night and day, and to write with this thing of art words clear as the lightning's play." By the time of George Pratt's death in 1875, handwriting was reaching a new stage. Schools were using steel pens widely for the first time. Popular education was booming in Europe and in the United States, and especially bureaucracy was growing. Governments were getting larger, the banking system was expanding, there were more and more opportunities in commerce, and through it all, handwriting had been an extremely important skill. As Sir Joseph explained in Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore, produced in 1878, "I served the writs with a smile so bland, and I copied all the letters in a big round hand. I copied all the letters in a hand so free that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy." Clear penmanship was so important that it was an essential part of anybody's business education. And some business schools that still exist in the United States were originally founded primarily as schools of penmanship. But there was a problem in the mass application of literacy. And that is that the more people learned to write, the more offices grew, the more the differences in handwriting became an obstacle to conducting business. In principle, the individual clerk was supposed to be a copying machine. Handwriting instruction was supposed to repress individuality. Each nation had its own style of writing. You've probably seen the French version of the round hand. This is the hand in which the Declaration of Independence and other great documents were written. And the French developed a very distinctive style which you can still see today in bistro menus. This was drilled into generations of French students, and in fact, one French cultural official said that blue ink stains are the mark of the French state on the body of the French student. The problem with all of these systems, though, is that once they were out of school, people started to assert their individuality. Even in France, for example, one manufacturer's catalog offered 500 different nibs, and each nib was slightly different in the way that it expressed the user's handwriting. It reminds me of Charles de Gaulle's remark about how you can govern a nation that has 246 kinds of cheese. You can imagine in a bank or an insurance company how hard it would be to drill all employees to write in precisely the same way. You can also imagine how expensive it would be if somebody misinterpreted a numeral or even a person's name. So in the 1870s, there was a crisis of ensuring the uniformity of documents. And this is where the typewriter came in. The typewriter was developed in the very years that Pinafore was produced, in the years that the poet George Pratt died. It was not so much a machine for speed, although ultimately it did write faster than typical handwriting, but it was a kind of printing press that ensured uniformity. That's one of the reasons for the small number of variations of 19th century typewriter script. The whole point of it was to have only one or two fonts, really the same font in different sizes, so that in any office, no matter how many dozens or even hundreds of employees you had, everybody could read everybody else's writing. The typewriter became popular even when it was as expensive as computers later were in the 1980s. In fact, it was a requirement of many magazine and newspaper editors by the 1890s that copy had to be submitted in typewritten rather than handwritten form. And the reason for that was that a periodical typesetter could not take the time anymore to learn the peculiarities of each person's handwriting. Book editors still could. Book manuscripts could be submitted handwritten until the Second World War. But by 1890 or 1900, the typewriter had already established itself in publications and offices. That doesn't mean, though, that handwritten instruments haven't also increased, that the market hasn't grown. The typewriter didn't replace handwritten instruments. To the contrary, technology for handwriting continued to evolve in the age of the typewriter. For example, the fountain pen was developed in the 1890s to make it more efficient to write without having to go back to an inkwell. Pencils, which had been introduced in the late 18th century, remained very strong sellers and are so today. In the United States, for example, 3.6 billion pencils are used every year, 30 years after the introduction of the personal computer as we know it. Innovation in ink pens continued, especially since the 1950s, when the first really practical ballpoints were introduced in the United States. Since then, there have been roller balls, gel pens, many new kinds of ink systems that suggest that there is an insatiable demand for handwritten documents, sometimes annotated versions of those that have been printed out by computer, just as in the Renaissance and the early modern era, people were widely using their quill pens to annotate the margins of books. Handwriting has also played a surprisingly large role in the computer age. By simplifying production of keyboarded documents, the computer lets handwriting become less mechanical and more expressive, more individual. In fact, the biggest single innovation in computing, according to its creator, owed everything to the study of handwriting. Steve Jobs, in a speech that he gave in 2005, attributed the idea for the Macintosh computer to a calligraphy course that he took in Reed College after he had formally dropped out there. He said that what he'd learned there convinced him of the importance of having a computer that could display the full flair of graphics and the full variety of types, in addition to the standard fonts that previously had been available on personal computers. When the Mac was introduced, it was significant that on the screen in early advertisements, the type was not conventional computer type or even printed type, but a handwritten hello in a style that might have been used in an elementary school. The message of the Mac was a new level of user-friendliness, and it's the personality of handwriting, the element of individuality that was used so effectively in promoting it. Ironically, though, in 1984, Reed College abolished its calligraphy program and fired the instructor who'd been teaching it, although Reed alumni tell me that now the program has been restored. The Macintosh, though, has not been enough to save computer instruction in the schools. In fact, there are lots of people who seem to think Steve Jobs studied calligraphy, so we don't have to. Many schools are abolishing the teaching of cursive writing. Some are spending very little time on any writing at all. And there's quite a controversy in the educational community about this. There are some people, like the neuroscientist Dr. Frank Wilson, who believe that learning handwriting is an important developmental step for children in coordinating the hand and the brain, and they regard dropping handwriting as an educational disaster. On the other hand, there are scholars like the professor of English, Dennis Barron, who think that it's about time we got rid of what is really a mechanical business and concentrated on the creative side of writing that the keyboard makes possible. Whatever the outcome of that debate, the controversy is unlikely to end soon. And it isn't only in the United States that handwriting instruction is in trouble. German schools are starting to drop handwriting instruction, and there aren't many people who can still read 19th century German bureaucratic and commercial writing, which was called Kurrentschrift. If you've ever seen a sample of it, it looks like a series of closely spaced diagonal lines with tiny variations. that was supposed to be a very efficient style of writing for the person writing it, and other people at the time were able to read it. But now there are so few that some people are making very good livings as professional consultants who will transcribe 19th century legal documents for real estate and other transactions. Is the outlook for handwriting grim? I don't really think so. I spoke at a local library on this topic recently, and I was impressed by the number of school-age kids who, when I took a vote, voted with their parents for retaining traditional handwriting instruction. I think there's an element of self-expression that can be enhanced by technological tools. Today's smartphones and tablet computers are friendlier to handwriting than technology has been for a long time. It's easy to imagine using these devices not only to capture handwriting, but to study it and practice it, and at least one handwriting consultant now has an app available for the iPhone that promises just that. The debate on handwriting versus keyboarding will never be settled. Philosophers have disagreed on this among themselves. Nietzsche found the typewriter to be liberating. Heidegger denounced it because it concealed handwriting and thus the personality. One thing we can be sure of, that when it comes to writing, technology and culture will continue to interact in unpredictable ways.